Hi, this is George. Thank you for checking out my presentation. Uh, the subject is The Queering of Horror Film Studies, Revising the History of Hollywood Slasher Films. When I first started doing my research for this project, I decided to focus on horror in some way. So, as I reviewed the Society for Cinema Studies conference archives and started to look through the different panels, I noticed that there was a subset of the horror genre, queer horror, that I thought would be a cool and interesting topic. As I began in the 1990s, and actually prior to that, any mention of gay or queer horror was more coded and generally probably discussed under panels about gender or maybe feminist theory, but they were more explicitly mentioned as queer as the decades went on. In the 90s, Benshoff was really focused on looking into the past and examining homosexual monsters in the 1950s. In the 2000s, Scott Hill was doing his research on his queer reading of The Exorcist. In the 2010s, we start to see more explicit use of the term queer and horror put together and the topics themselves. Scholarship was also shared on queer boogeymen, queer slashers, coding the male scream in horror cinema, and the queerness of Elm Street. A lot of these early researchers were building off of the research of Benshoff. He returned in 2021 along with Peter Mara, who was presenting his dissertation in 2016 on queer horror and is now in 2021 was leading a panel on queer slashers. So from there, I decided to do a deep dive into the research sources that I identified from the panels. I was able to find some research examples and essays and other forms of writing that Harry Benshoff had done and Peter Mara. And unfortunately, some of the other folks were, I just couldn't find any trace of their writing anywhere. So um, I had to expand my search, and that was actually a good thing because I was able to include some more diverse voices in the discussion, including a trans researcher and at least one female identifying writer. When I first started doing research for this project, I myself, as a queer man, wasn't entirely sure what queer horror was. So I thought this might be an interesting slide just to pause and show folks this is the wide array from, say, the last century of horror films that can be classified as queer horror. I think it's just really interesting because it just shows the variety, and we'll get into why these are considered queer horror in the next slide. When Benshoff released his book in 1997, it was really influential, and at the time was really filling a gap that was missing from cinema and film studies. What this quote I think does a nice job of is really articulating why historiography is so important, especially to um, the way that queer horror is remembered, told, and how it is studied actually. So one of the other interesting things that he discusses in his writing is how horror film monsters are often seen as metaphors for queerness, and they are often even queer coded, especially for the ones that he was studying prior to 1997. They just really weren't very clearly articulated as queer characters. One of my favorite takeaways from Benshoff's work is that he really clearly explains how queerness might intersect with horror films. And he basically identifies four broad ways that it can happen. The first is that a horror film might have queer characters. Sometimes these are explicitly gay characters, sometimes they're the main characters, sometimes they're just like people walking by, but it's like queer people exist in this film's universe. The second is that horror films with queer or culturally perceived queer creative teams, such as the writer, director, producer, or cast, can be considered queer. So even people who Like, for example, Jennifer Tilly has become quite a queer icon. So just her being in Chucky movies can at times queer the movie. The third is that horror films with queer subtext or connotations can be considered queer horror. That would definitely apply to like the um, earlier readings of Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, which I'll get into in a few slides. But over time, um, as seen in example 4, horror films are viewed by queer spectators. And when the queer spectators view them, they can find or identify or recognize, say, queer readings or connotations that were just hidden from everybody else. And so those 4 ways are a great sort of takeaway that we'll see kind of pop up with each of these next queer readings from other experts and other films. The Exorcist might not immediately come to mind when we think about queer horror, but Scahill argues that Regan, the girl possessed in the film, and Linda Blair, the actress who portrays her, are in fact queer horror icons. He also argues a queer reading of the film parallels a story about queer conversion therapy being combined with exorcism in the 2000s. Hellbent touted itself as the first all gay slasher film when it was released, but according to Claire Cisco King's take on the film and its place in queer history, it comes across like a cautionary tale for queers. The film's message and promotional materials conveyed a be queer, get killed narrative. To this day, the Chucky series continues to break ground in queer horror both in film and television. Halbertstam, a gender nonconformist, sees Chucky and Tiffany and their children Glenn and Glenda not as queer monsters, but as queer pioneers. Glenn and Glenda's story continues to queer the franchise today in sci-fi's Chucky series, where the dual role is portrayed by Lachlan Watson, a non-binary actor. Adam Christopher Scales advanced queer horror slasher scholarship in the 2010s by trying to better understand queer horror spectatorship in online spaces. He argues that gay fans forge deep emotional connections with horror that links particular textual features to the construction and articulation of their sexual and fanish identities. End quote. He found that gay horror fandom is constructed and performed differently across fan spaces, and it's a way that gay identity is formed in culturally meaningful ways. And this all ties back to what Benshoff said, quote, the figure of the monster can frequently be equated with that of the homosexual. What this means from decade to decade and from film to film can be shown to change dramatically, according to the forces behind the production, as well as the societal awareness and understanding of human sexuality as it is constructed in various historical periods. Mara also builds on Benshoff's work in his dissertation on queer slashers. He makes the observation that in most slasher films, the killer is the most interesting and charismatic character, aside from the final girl. Queer audiences can identify with both the slasher and the final girl. He also sees queer slashers as a form of queer resistance. Reagan Fox argues that by challenging the heteronormative impulses used to frame a media artifact like Freddy's Revenge as significant and successful enough to merit investigation, the film's memory can be validated. When Freddy's Revenge was released in 1985, the AIDS crisis was new and frightening to gay men, and AIDS panic had swept through Hollywood. Unfortunately, this meant that the obvious queer references and subtext in the film were quick to be dismissed by the cis hetero filmmakers, who even put some blame for the film's perceived gayness on its star. Fox used his low theory of Queer Failure to explore how queer historical artifacts like Elm Street 2 were straightwashed in the 1980s amid conservative backlash towards gay men. The social, political, and historical context of the evolution of queer horror studies and queer slashers is laid out here in a timeline pyramid. It represents the major events in recent queer history and activism alongside the Society for Cinema and Media Studies conference panel topics. As you can see, in the 1980s, the Reagan administration was notoriously slow to respond to the AIDS crisis. The activism of the 80s led to the emergence of queer theory in the 1990s. Before queer theory, gender theory was likely where this scholarship could be found. In 1997, Benshoff wrote that there were no queer heroes or heroines to be found in horror films. By 2004, Hellbent, the first gay slasher film, was released. Sadly, these years were also the era of too many LGBTQ plus hate crimes to name. At least one serial killer who targeted gay men, and the military's don't ask, don't tell policy. By the 2010s, LGBTQ plus rights and activism resulted in the Supreme Court's upholding of the right to same sex marriages. During the same decade, queer horror scholarship expanded into new territories and became a more inclusive academic body. Sadly, like in the 80s, a wave of conservative backlash fueled by the far right has begun to assault the rights of queer people. In a sign of strong queer resistance, the queer slasher genre and its scholarship have become even queerer by revising queer horror history and because queer horror has found massive audiences on streaming platforms like American Horror Story and Chucky.